Welcome to this best practice bite looking at local eligibility criteria for carers, which is a key part of the Carers Scotland Act. So the Act sets out that every local authority has to set local eligibility criteria for carers. It also says that in setting local eligibility criteria, they have to involve carers in its development and also consult with the organisations that represent carers. It also says when the eligibility criteria need to be in place and they need to be finalised before April 2018 when the Act comes into force. The statutory guidance provides more detail on the development of local eligibility criteria. So it proposes that all local authorities use the same suite of indicators, and these are the ones set out in the National Care Organisation Framework, which I'll explain a wee bit more about later. It also says that they have local discretion in establishing the threshold for support. In addition, the guidance sets out the process for using eligibility criteria, and I'll go through that in a wee minute. It gives examples of the sort of support that can be provided to carers. That's both eligible support for those who meet the threshold and non-eligible support that can be provided to carers through the power that local authorities already have. It talks about the importance of preventative support, so not just the support for carers where there is a large impact of their caring role, but also making sure carers get support as early as possible. And the need to take account of fluctuating conditions. So, for example, somebody looking after somebody with a mental illness may find that sometimes their caring role is quite intense, whereas other times when the person they look after is doing quite well, they may have a lesser caring role. So in looking at their eligibility, the guidance sets out that they should consider their needs over an appropriate period of time. There's also a section on young carers. Young carers may be looked at differently in terms of eligibility criteria. Local authorities may decide to have separate eligibility criteria for them, or they may decide to adapt the one that they've developed for adult carers, but the guidance sets out some things they need to consider in relation to young carers' needs. It sets out the self-directed support options because when carers are eligible for a service, they have to be given the self-directed support options to choose from and how they wish to take up that service, similar to the way it is currently with disabled people. And finally, it sets out how they need to consult with local carers in the development of eligibility criteria, when they need to be published and when they need to be reviewed. And finally, it goes through as a best practice examples, the National Care Organisations Framework. Firstly, the first stage is preparing the adult carer support plan or the young carers statement, and that should set out what the carer's personal outcomes are. The second stage is looking at how those needs can be met, and the first thing that local authorities need to do in that is look at services to the cared for person and also universal and community services. So they need to check to see what needs can be met through those routes. Thirdly, if those needs are met wholly through those areas, through services to the cared for person and universal services, then it may be that the carer doesn't meet the eligibility threshold, but that needs to be kept under review. If the needs don't meet eligibility, then they need to look at the power. So it's not that if a carer doesn't meet eligibility, they won't get any service. They need to look at the sort of things that can be provided to them, for example, through their local carer centre, maybe attending support groups and being assisted to attend local community groups. If they do meet eligibility, then the SDS options apply, and they also have to consider whether that support will take the form of a break from caring. So what can carers expect if they meet local eligibility criteria? The local authority then has a duty to meet their identified eligible needs, and this can be any type of support. It might include things like a short break, replacement care for the cared for person to allow the carer to take a break, support to access leisure facilities or leisure pursuits, and it should be focused on the carer's solutions and things that carers have identified themselves to help them, similar in a way to the way the Time to Live Fund is being used at the moment. If carers don't meet eligibility criteria locally, it's still important that they receive support. And the importance of preventative services is absolutely key. And it's not really about what services are eligible or non-eligible. So for example, a short break might be provided to a carer where they don't meet the threshold through the Act, for example, through the Time to Live Fund or through other schemes locally. So I'm now going to explain a bit about the National Carer Organisations Framework. This was developed by the National Carer Organisations as the bill was going through Parliament, and it was co-produced by carers. So we took it to local care centres and local care groups and asked carers what they thought about it and made changes according to their views. We also checked out with them how it would work in their own personal situations to make sure it could apply to carers in lots of different circumstances. Then when the Act went through and they were developing the guidance for eligibility, we worked with COSLA, ADSW and the Scottish Government, and some further changes were made, and it was agreed to include the framework in the statutory guidance. So the framework itself is more or less based on 2 diagrams and a table of indicators. You can get the full explanation in the statutory guidance, but this is just to explain a little bit about it to you now. So the triangle, what it does is it illustrates where the threshold for support sits. It's likely that most carers won't meet the local threshold for support. Only those whose caring role has had a critical or a substantial impact on their lives are likely to meet the eligibility threshold. Those where there is a moderate impact or a low or no impact on their lives can still and should be able to access local services to support them in their caring role through the power that local authorities currently have. One thing that was agreed in the framework and agreed with COSLA and ADSW is differently to the way eligibility works with disabled people. With carers, it's important to look at the many different areas of their life that caring can have an impact on. So we've set those out within the table and also this diagram, the circle, and it very much has an outcome-focused approach. So the areas included are health and well-being, finances, life balance, relationships, living environment, employment and training. So when assessing a carer, it's important to look at each of these areas and see where there are impacts for the carer, and if there are substantial or critical impacts, that means they would reach eligibility, the eligibility threshold, and would be entitled to the self-directed support options. What's particularly important is if they have a critical impact in just one of those areas, then they would reach the threshold. So it's not the sum of all of them. It could be just one area, for example, their employment might be affected by their caring role, and they may be at risk of losing their job, in which case that would be a critical impact of their caring role. Whereas their health and well-being and their finance might be okay at the time, that particular area may have a critical impact for them. We also produced a table of indicators. I won't go into too much explanation of them, but it looks at the sort of things that needs to be assessed in terms of whether a carer has a low risk, a moderate risk, a substantial risk or a critical risk in each of these areas. And they can be used by assessors to see whether or not somebody is going to meet eligibility. One thing it's important to say is this shouldn't be too much of a bureaucratic exercise. We don't expect people to sit down with the diagrams and the table when they're talking to carers. It should be very much about a conversation. And this is something that should be in their mind whenever they're doing that, looking at the different areas and looking to see where the impact is. But hopefully it shouldn't be about filling in forms and making it a lengthy bureaucratic process. This is the second half of the indicators table. Like I say, it is available in the statutory guidance in full there as well. So what happens next? Well, local authorities, I'm sure, will be developing their eligibility criteria at the moment and need to be consulting with carers on it. We would imagine that they will start to finalise that in the beginning of 2018. It's likely there'll be some variation in approach in terms of applying eligibility criteria. The thresholds may be set at different levels. We're not sure about that, but we'll be looking at each of the local eligibility criteria and trying to do a comparison on what's happening across Scotland. A review process for eligibility criteria is part of the Act, and there is also the ability for, over time, for the government, if it's not working locally, to develop national eligibility criteria. That is a possibility within the Act, and it's something they'll need to scrutinise and look at quite carefully over the coming years. So that is this best practice bite. I hope that's been helpful to you. Any questions, you can contact the Coalition of Carers, and we'll try and help you with that.